the visiting friends we have with us. The Lord be with you today, and may the day itself. We got a lot of people out here on vacation and some up to Blooming with them in their meeting, and let's just remember them, that wherever they're at, if they're traveling, why, the Lord will be with them. Now, this morning, brothers and sisters, we're going to go in further portion of this message, and we want to, I got some pages of the Jerusalem Post. Naturally there's some things that's took place in the past few days, such as this, what looks like a temporary peace, at least between the Palestinian Arabs in certain occupied areas. I got a section there I'm going to read just to show you what the government of Israel really is saying and what they mean. Now, we put a tape up here which represents an extension of this line right here, which points, now this, which looks like a Bible, represents the 70th week of Daniel. In the first half and the last half are two distinct different periods of a total 7-year period known as the 70th week of Daniel. We've got to realize the 70th week, wherever in time it is negotiated and is signed by Israel, that sets in motion the last 7 years of man's human government on the face of this earth. There's no need of, in your mind, playing with time from there on. Well, but suppose, what if? Don't do that. The week of Daniel, as it climaxes, ends man's human governmental time, because Jesus Christ comes as this is closing out. And that's why we can read, brothers and sisters, when it says that Jesus Christ himself is the one that destroys this man of sin by the brightness of his coming and by the word of his mouth, we have to realize that's not some 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 month drawn out period like human beings would do things. It has absolutely got to be understood. It is a precise time factor, and that's why Jesus said in Matthew 24, pointing to the last days, and he said immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, he's not talking about other periods of time when there has been severe persecution, tribulation by different societies brought about by different human governments. He's talking about this that's under the Antichrist. He said immediately, and he didn't mean 6 months later, immediately. Amen. Shall the sun be darkened, and so forth, and then shall appear the sign of the coming of the Son of Man in power and great glory. In other words, he's literally coming as we would see him then in Revelation chapter 19. He's coming then to take over the government and the kingdoms of this world, and he will be the king of all the earth in that hour. Now we want to familiarize you a little bit with something other here today. And this, to me, is something that definitely will stand out very vividly in the time factor that we're now living in. And if you have your Bibles, turn with me in Hosea chapter 6. We're drawing up a chart representing this time factor. Now I'm reading here from Hosea chapter 6, as we have in Thursday night's message read it, but we must read it again this morning to familiarize ourselves with the prophetic setting. The first verse is dealing with how that somewhere in the ending of time there will be a spirit begin to move upon the Jewish people as they are scattered throughout the earth in dispersion. And they will begin then to work together and plan to set things in motion. Come and let us return unto the Lord. For he hath torn and he will heal us. He hath smitten and he will bind us up. That absolutely is pointing to the beginning of the Zionist movement that began to be negotiated and initiated by various rabbis and religious leaders universally scattered around the world within the Jewish societies, as they began to perceive by certain things that time was running out and they needed to do something to prepare the heart of the Jewish people all over the world to get ready to return to the land of their heritage. Now, this second verse is a prophecy, and we can see here, brothers and sisters, it was prophesied almost 800 years before Christ. It's prophesied before the 10 tribes of northern Israel was taken into captivity. Therefore, no Jew at that time knew what this was pointing to. But it's looking down through the span of time to the last days, and that's the time we're living in. After 2 days will he revive us. In the third day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight, because he will be here. He'll be sitting in Jerusalem in the new rebuilt temple as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now let's look at that prophecy very carefully. After 2 days. Now then, since that's a prophecy in the Old Testament, and at that time the prophet had nothing in mind that could possibly, brothers and sisters, to have acquainted him that there's going to be a period of time we Gentiles would refer to as the Grace Age. And we can say this, since we've got a fixed point by how to apply this prophecy, and the fixed point is, it's the 70th week of Daniel. No other place will Israel be revived. How many realize that? It's the 11th chapter of Revelation. There is where the revival takes place. It's in the first part of Daniel's 70th week. It is also portrayed in the 7th chapter, as there is 144,000 sealed away. Where does it take place? In the first part of Daniel's 70th week. There's a 3.5-year period. And a 3.5-year period is not solar time, it's prophetic time, meaning 1,260 days. So now, brothers and sisters, this morning, I am going to do my best to definitely differentiate between what is called solar time and prophetic time, because prophecy does and is many times terminated and interpreted as we look at things through prophetic time. For here is a fact, brothers and sisters. Why would the Bible speak so specifically in the 11th chapter that he will give power unto his 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days? That is absolutely half of that's just exactly half of 7 years. But keep in mind, it's not half of 3.5 years of solar time. Because if you was to absolutely multiply 3.5 years of solar time, you will have more than 1,260 days. If you don't believe it, just take a pencil and paper and figure it up. So you can see this is prophetic. It's a prophetic formula. And that's why it's worded that way. Why does it say in Revelation 13, and power was given unto this man of sin, that he should continue 42 months. But keep in mind, 42 months does not mean solar time. It's got to be, brothers and sisters, that it is a balanced 360-day year, and therefore each one of these months is looked upon as 30 days each, which would also make it 1,260 days. Now, with that in mind, brothers and sisters, it is important that we look at biblical fixed times. Because here's where people miss, and not that I'm that smart, But it's just absolutely, I believe, we're getting close to the end of time. Everybody, even in the natural, there's people in the world, well, they'll say it like this. Well, doesn't on about the eve of every 2,000 years, there always seems to be something take place. And if we look at it from a biblical setting, that seems to be the pattern of things. We are 7 years away, solar time, from the year 2000 AD, after the advent and birth of Christ, which this period of time is identified by. And in that time, it's solar time. That's what constitutes a year. But we can say this, that after 2 days, that don't mean 2 days of 24 hours. That is 2 prophetic days of 1,000 years each. We take that from the Epistle of Peter, that 1,000 years is as 1 day, and 1 day as 1,000 years. Because a day in that respect is not talking about a day of 24 hours. It's talking about a dispensational day. So, when the prophet that prophesied it did not see the grace age as we see it, therefore when he uttered this is pliable to how God will deal with Israel. Now then, with the week of Daniel, some were fixed as to where this revival is going to take place. Then we realize this. If we are measuring prophetic time back 2,000 prophetic years, it's got to bring us back somewheres to some calculated point of beginning. Will you agree with me? Now that's the question. And it's all in the Bible if we will look at things rightly. But in this respect, the beginning of this is questionable on our standpoint. The fixed end is here. We know that's where the revival takes place. And we know the millennium follows on. That's the 3rd day. That's when he will be here. That's when he will rule and reign. And that's when the nation of Israel is going to shine, brothers and sisters, above all the other nations of the earth. That's why the 3rd verse reads like that. But let's just take this morning. The week of Daniel. And we are going back through time. Now as we go back through time, brothers and sisters, there's 2 points in history where we can bring this. We can either bring it back to 70 AD. That's when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman army under Titus, and it fell on August the 10th, 70 AD, and the city was demolished, the temples in ruins, and the remaining Jews were sold to the various nations on the slave trade. That set in motion, brothers and sisters, a long period of Jewish dispersion that was prophesied in the 1st chapter of Hosea. But now, we have a question. If we take these 2,000 prophetic years and go back just to 70 AD, here's what we come up with. It means that the week of Daniel cannot start until somewhere around 2035. How many understands me? We've got a chart we're fixing up that we will be giving you and showing you how to look at this. Now, brothers and sisters, the reason I'm going to say the next thing is the world don't have that much time. Everything is being moved in place, and the world don't realize what's going on. The very fact, brothers and sisters, Israel has now been brought to a precise time factor that she's faced with some kind of an ultimatum. What will she do? Will she, in concessions, give up land, back off, and keep doing that? We've got to realize, brothers and sisters, as all these other prophecies we read Thursday night, as they feed into this picture, I am convinced once God, by conditions, as He has in the past, set before the restoration of the people, the beginning of the restoration of them as a nation, and as they was compelled in 67 to take land which they did not even plan at that time, then somehow or other, though it may look right now that somewhere in the near future Israel could be pressured to give up. But on the other hand, brothers and sisters, if we're looking at a prophetic picture, and there's many things we can look at it in the light of, we've got to realize what appears on the surface to the eye right now may look questionable, misgiving, and uncertain. But keep in mind, there's prophecies that points in the last days, and when God does these things in the last days, it's not going to take Him 40, 50 long years to do these things in the Middle East, because, brothers and sisters, that's the way we Gentiles look at things. But when God does something with Israel, it's not drug out over years in respect to certain events. So with that in mind, we do not have enough time, the way other things are fitting together, to say that then the week of Daniel can't come until around 2035. Because, brothers and sisters, if we're measuring this 2,000 years prophetic time back to 70 A.D., then take that span of time, then break it down into prophetic time, it'll take you through, brothers and sisters, to around 2035 before the week can start. And therefore, brothers and sisters, here's why I say it can't go that long. Because, brothers and sisters, these prophecies, as we look at them through these frames which we will call windows, we could go back to 1939. That was a precise year. As I read, brothers and sisters, in the year of 89, when the Jerusalem Post came out in the month of March. And the writer of that article, a headline article, 50 years ago this month, the world entered an era of time from which there is no return. When I read that, I said, there is a precise time factor in the minds of the Jewish editorial writers, historians, commentators, and such, that something was set in motion. Because in Austria, Jews began to be rounded up, questioned. And that was the beginning of a process of God fulfilling prophecies that will develop in the last days. That's why when you go to Jeremiah 16, verses 14 and 18, as we read there about the gradual restoration and the people of Israel coming back in the last days, the first He said He would send fishermen. And we perceive what that is talking about. Naturally, it's symbolic language, but the symbolic language has got to be understood in earthly events. So when the old Zionist rabbis, philosophers, and leaders begin to go to the various Jewish societies scattered through the world and begin to say, gentlemen, the time has come, we must prepare to go home. I'll never forget in 68, there in Israel, that old rabbi told me, he says, when they did that, he said many times they was booed. Then, brothers and sisters, we come to the year of 1939. And then what does the prophecy of Jeremiah say? Then after that He will send hunters, and He will hunt them from the hills and the valleys. And if you could read, brothers and sisters, the dark years between 39 and 45, how the Jew, he looked for every crevice and nook and cave and cellar and attic in every kind of circumstances scattered throughout Central Europe and Western Europe to hide from the SS and the Gestapo officers. But they was rounded up by truckloads and trainloads and shipped from country to certain points to face death, butchered and slaughtered like worse than animals at the Louisville stockyards, being carted off to some meat processing factory. That's why we have to see what the hunters were, because God was putting a pressure. He was putting a fear upon the Jewish society. And keep in mind, in these last days, as these things begin to come to an end, we've got to make them fit the words of Jesus, Matthew 24. And he plainly tells us there, as he refers to the fig tree, the rebirth of Israel and the rising of Israel in national power and beginning to climb to world preeminence, Jesus said this: when you see all these things coming to pass, this generation shall not pass away till all things, that's pointing to the last days. Not something other that's carried over in the millennium, but everything that's pointing to the last days and what constitute last day will be fulfilled. This generation. Now we want to do this. Every character has got his idea of what a generation is. One say, well, it's 40 years. Another says 50 years. And another, he wants to go to 100 years. It is not 100 years. It is true, when you study, brothers and sisters, the genealogy of Christ and how they relate that in Matthew or Luke, there it is. There's 40 years between this man and there's 40 years between that man, and so on and so forth. That's true. That's talking about a generation. But when we look to the advent of Christ, and we look to how things was fulfilled in his first advent, from the time that Christ was born, which set certain prophecies in motion. And as time progressed, and he comes to his baptism, then he's anointed and he ministers 3.5 years. Then he comes to Calvary. All along through those years, certain prophecies that spoke of this is being fulfilled. Then from his crucifixion to 70 A.D., we've got a span of 70 years at the most there. God has exclusively dealt with the Jewish nation that's been restored in the land. Therefore, at the end of 70 years, he sends the Roman army and destroys them. And they're scattered, never to be dealt with no more until only in the last days. Now my point is this, and the reason I illustrate that 70 A.D., that's not where we terminate this line. Because as I say, we would have to push the week of Daniel over here to 2035. That's where it figures out to be. But if it's got to be to a fixed time, the only other fixed time you can find in the Bible that you could measure that from and have scriptural, logical, sensible means, you got to take it to 33 A.D. That's when Jesus was crucified. Now, if we can see what happened and understand prophetic what had happened, 33 A.D. in the advent of Christ brings Israel to the end of Daniel's 69 weeks of prophetic time. That was God's measuring stick to them. Now let's study that a little bit. As I said, measuring stick. Keep in mind, that 69 weeks, as you read in Daniel 9, verses 25 and 26, it definitely had a beginning point in time. But notice it did not stipulate just exactly where this 69 weeks or 483 prophetic years would end, as far as giving them a chart to go by. But if they would have recognized the decree that came in Nehemiah's day, and they would have been spiritually walking in the light of that, do you know what that yardstick should have told some of them Jewish leaders? If they had have really believed their prophet, they should have understood that somewhere, as they begin to get down here in the last 35 or 40 years of this point of time, they could begin to look at one another and say, gentlemen, I perceive that by the Word of God, we must be entering an era of time that we can expect our Messiah. Because first off, they've got a fixed point. Remember, gentlemen, the decree that Nehemiah came with to build the walls? They weren't ignorant of that. That was recorded in their own chronology. It's just that a fixed ending wasn't written, but it was described, brothers and sisters, in a concealed way by showing them that as this 69th week, or we will say as this 483 years is coming to a climax, somewhere unbeknownst to them through their ignorance. And that's where Paul, brothers and sisters, in Romans 11 gets his revelation and understanding. Blindness is happened to Israel in part. He didn't lay all the blame onto them, but he said in part, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. So we perceive then that those rabbis, which should have been watching those 69 weeks come about, then when they begin to hear of this man that began to preach and do miracles, should that not have caused them to go to the prophet of Hosea? Daniel? Should that not have caused them to begin to wonder, gentlemen, this could be our Messiah. Look at our yardstick. But no. They begin to find all kinds of faults with this man. Their school of thought wouldn't let them see a thing. And I'll have to say, our Gentile religious world today, brothers and sisters, is under the same kind of a picture. Amen. There's writings in the Bible, brothers and sisters. It's been there ever since the prophet of old picked up a pen and wrote it. But our Gentile religious mind is absolutely just as blind as at daylight from dark to how they fit into the picture. But let's look at this Jew as he ignorantly, through his own perceived school of thought and his traditional interpretation, knew they couldn't see nothing in this man that looked like anything. But brothers and sisters, if they would have read that as this 69 weeks are coming to an end, the Messiah, the Prince, shall be cut off, but not for himself. They should have realized, brothers and sisters, what was going on when they began to hear all the fussing, false accusation. Jerusalem was in an uproar. Because keep in mind, brothers and sisters, as Jesus approached the time that spring Passover, people was to go to it, they even asked him before he left Galilee, are you going to the Passover? He stayed behind. The rest of the family went ahead. And so he went more or less in a concealed way. And therefore, when he did come to Jerusalem, everybody in Jerusalem, do you reckon he'll come? What was going on? Jerusalem was in an uproar. They was going to get that man and put him where he needed to be. We are tired of this devil coming here, wrecking our tradition, our beautiful religious ceremonial program. Yet they were basing it on the Bible, but without a revelation. Now with that, brothers and sisters, they stood in the streets, and there was their Messiah, the man absolutely that was to be cut off exactly at the ending of the 69th week, which absolutely came right to the day, brothers and sisters, that 69th week was fulfilled. Jesus Christ was crucified, and they did not know that he was their Messiah that fulfilled them 69 weeks. Now, my point in going through all that is this, and so you'll have to follow me. We have got to understand then that 33 AD, when Jesus is crucified, as that ended the 69th week, and there's an interval of time between the closing of that and the initiating the 70th one, there is a span of time which the prophet did not know how long it would be. But now that we're coming towards the end of our grace age, we then have to begin to measure this back, because we've got a fixed point where it ends. But are we smart enough to take it back through time and somehow or other come to understanding where did it begin? Just as they did not know how to end their 69th week, we are in the same position. And are we going to be caught sound asleep, that we don't know where to begin? It's beginning with us. It was ending with them. That's the point I've got to trying to illustrate. So you take it back to 69, the end of the 69th week, which falls exactly 33 AD. Now, if 33 AD is the point that God indirectly has in mind when he had the prophet to prophesy the language of this, and we see where Israel is going to be revived at the end of them 2 dispensational days, then here's how we can look at this time. 33 AD, we come to the year 2000. Now, let me say this, brothers and sisters. 2000 AD, and I'll ask anybody that's got a calculator. I run this all through a calculator yesterday. 2000 AD, calendar time, solar time, falls short of the full prophetic time that this is to be 4.5 years. Now you say, Brother Jackson, you've got me hung up. I'm confused. No, I haven't. Let me repeat myself and look at it this way. 2000 years, calendar time, solar time, starts with the birth of Christ, not 33 AD. How many sees that? How many do? But this 2000 years prophetic time that begins here with this covenant of this week takes you only back to the crucifixion of Christ, 33 AD. So you can see there's 33 years you drop off on that end. How many sees that? That's where you've got to figure the difference. Now then, so that gives us, if we drop off 33 years there between the record of his birth and death, we actually come up with 1967 solar calendar years, bringing us to the year 2000 AD solar time. How many catches that now? 1967 years between 33 AD and the year 2000 calendar solar time. Now then, how do we reconcile this calendar solar time? When you take that calendar solar time, brothers and sisters, and realize you're dealing with 1967 years. But as we're going to convert it then to prophetic time, it is simple to realize, since you've got the whole number, 1967, you drop the 5 1/4 days off of each one of them, you've got 1967 to start with. But then when you take 1967 and multiply that times 5 1/4, you come out at the end of that span of time with 10,300 and some odd more extra days that you convert to prophetic time, which then gives you exactly 28.5 years added to 1967, which then gives you, brothers and sisters, from 33 AD to the year 2000, we will say, when this week would start, if that's the way we're going to put the week, you've got 1995 and 1/2 years. Now, with that in mind, brothers and sisters, I want you to sit there and think this morning. The year 2000 is only 7 years away. Will you agree with me? I know one thing, brothers. If we all live, and we live to the year 2000 AD, you rest assured, 7 years from now, the calendar will read year 2000. And you know, I'm wondering what the calendar publishers, even the world, is going to put on that year that the world enters that millennium, or the ending of that millennium, 2000. I can't help but feel, brothers and sisters, they're going to really put on the dog. Well, we made it to 2000 AD. But in actuality, from 33 AD, which is solar time, to that time, 1967 solar years. But when it's converted to prophetic time, you've got exactly 1995 and 1/2 years. Now that lets us know, brothers and sisters, if the week of Daniel then is to literally start at the ending of the 2 days, you know what that would tell us? That would tell you that by the year 2005, the week of Daniel should be in place. Now, if I can figure that in my head, surely to goodness you can figure that on paper. I'm not that smart. No, but brother, it's actually you've been going over this a long time. Well, when we get the charts fixed up, you can have it and you can look at it for yourself. But keep in mind, you're converting solar time to prophetic time, and that's the way you've got to do it. Because you can't come running from way back there, brothers and sisters, 33 AD, because you're dealing with absolutely 483 years prophetic time. And it's true, man measures this time factor in here as solar time. But when we come here, you're back again to prophetic time. So this has got to be converted to prophetic time. You can't have prophetic time, solar time, then prophetic time again. That's the way you've got to look at it. So with that in mind, brothers and sisters, as we can begin to recognize then the time factor that man's living in, then this chart, keep in mind, this chart then only represents and illustrates how we perceive these prophecies that are related to in the Bible from the year 1939 up to now. And as we move on. But my point is, brothers and sisters, we can see at the most, if the beginning point of measurement goes back to the crucifixion of Christ and not to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Because if we move it up to the destruction of the temple, then brothers and sisters, this week of Daniel cannot come about until somewhere around 2035. And I have to say, brothers and sisters, that takes the future and the coming of Christ as far as his millennium reign far beyond our generation, even when I myself remember that. And there's men sitting in here that belong to the same generation of my hour. I don't have to be alive. That's not what I'm looking at. But I am looking at a generation that my age people represent. Yes, I remember 39. And brothers and sisters, that's why somewhere right in here is the beginning of a generation factor, both to the Gentile side as well as the Jewish side. And if you was to go to Israel today, you will find Jewish people in their late 60s who absolutely was young children in the concentration camps. Even some that survived them. Even some that were hid and survived the Holocaust. They lost their parents. They have grew up from childhood, even some from infancy. And they can tell you of the horrors and the tragedies, how they lost their daddy and mother. And that's why, brothers and sisters, we can't push this line to 2035. That takes all those people out of the picture. It takes everything out of the generation that's lived to see these end time things coming about. In other words, brothers and sisters, keep in mind, when the time starts, that there's certain signs that's spoken of in the Bible as to be marking pointers. That's why Jesus spoke of them in Matthew 24 like he did. They are markers along the highway of life. And that generation that begins to see these markers, sure, many of them will die off before they get to the end. But somewhere is a generation that can also say, I was a young girl, I was a young boy, I was of such an age, I remember when such and such a thing happened. Somewhere as this thing is all over, and all these prophecies are fulfilled and in place, there'll be a bunch of those people still alive. And that's why we can say, brothers and sisters, somewhere when Jesus was born, there was a few children living in the neighborhood, and eventually throughout the countryside, that began to hear the story. I understand there was a woman that gave birth to a strange little baby boy down in Bethlehem. Did you hear that story? Yeah. Notice, it never went on record as far as the government. But brothers and sisters, do you think them sheep herders went back out there the next day and herded sheep? Oh, forget the whole thing. It's all a hoax. Those sheep herders never will forget how they heard the angels sing and told them, rise up, for there is this day in the city of David. And they could see the candle lights just across the landscape. Go seek him. And I cannot help but believe, brothers and sisters, when them sheep herders came back to their camps, they never slept the rest of the night. That is, if they even got back there the rest of the night. But my point is this. From that hour on, there was a rumor, there was a story that began to be spread throughout the countryside. There is a woman in this land. She gave birth to an unusual child. We understand that some sheep herders. Now, if we would look at the overall religious society of Israel that day, like our Gentile society, they say, oh, that's nonsense. I don't believe in that stuff. And right here in the Jerusalem Post, a writer, right here in 1993, as he is discussing his own nation as it exists today. And when I read it, I thought, you must be just like the Sadducees of old. They claimed to be Abraham's seed, but they didn't believe in angels, they didn't believe in a hereafter, nor they didn't even believe in spirits. But they was ready to say, I'm Abraham's seed, so what? I just heard it. I would just as soon have heard him say he's Apache Indian, if that's all the respect he's got for Abraham. Because I'd say if Abraham, his grandparent, would come down, he'd probably run him out of the country with a stick. To think a Jew that wants to lean on his genealogy, but he has no revelation. And right in this Jerusalem Post yesterday, that writer plainly states, was the birth of the statehood of Israel, was it a miracle? Was it an act of God? Or do we associate it that it was a process of man's human negotiation? Any man or woman in their right mind would know that it had to be an act of God. After time has went on at that time, 1900 years, and that out of the chaos and the disaster and the devastation of a war, the world is literally pressured. What will we do with these Jews? And there's only one logical thing those world leaders can do. God moved on them precisely at the right time to set the prophecies in motion. And that's why 1948, brothers and sisters, brings us to a time factor the nation was born. And that fulfills Isaiah, brothers and sisters, 66 verses 8 through 12. Now, if we can see this time factor, brothers and sisters, and as I say this in this message, I want to say, please, for goodness sakes, brothers and sisters, when we look at this, and we would perceive then that somewheres around the year 2000 AD or 2005 AD, this prophetic time is going to run to an end. And by all logical reasons, we can perceive then that somewhere in that time factor, that week of Daniel will come in motion. Because it's only 7 years to the year 2000. And brothers and sisters, then it would only be 4.5 more years to 205 or 2005, and you've got the prophetic dispensation in line. So with that now, let's keep in mind, we are not trying to predict a day, a year, or a month that Jesus Christ is coming. How many realize that? We are Gentiles. We are foolish people. We shouldn't, though, but we are. And all down through time, Gentiles have played with. He gets a hold of something. He's got to have a yardstick. He's got to have a set time. That's why last fall, October the 28th, here was these young characters walking the streets of Louisville over there, standing in front of bank buildings, in airports, passing out the tracts, divine revelation given to an Oriental prophet boy, just a kid. October the 28th, 1992, the end of the world is coming and Jesus Christ is coming for the rapture. And you're still here. You know what, brothers and sisters? All because somewhere they're hanging all them type of calculations all on something that is unrelated to a prophetic picture. They'll go into certain things of the law. They pull out certain types and say, according to the type here, it must be such and such. But keep in mind, the type is in the law. But until the nation of Israel returns to a time factor in which they are offering sacrifice on an altar again, and they've got a priestly order functioning in his role, those things in those prophecies of the future tense are still hanging still just like a stopwatch. Sure, there's Jews back home, but they're not offering sacrifice. So with that, brothers and sisters, we have to realize, for that particular point of a type that would be out of the law writing, like Leviticus, for it to be actually used as also a help in understanding the coming of the Lord, then that portion of that law has to be active, which it's not now. How many understand what I mean by that? There is no altar yet dedicated. There's no sacrifice on it. So therefore, any type pertaining in Leviticus that's pointing yet to the fall of the year, beginning in the 7th month, it's not in action. How many realize it? That's the way you have to look at it. All right. Now, with this, my brother, he gave me a paper a while ago, and the reason I'm wanting to deal with things like this morning, you're going to see in this religious world another spirit rise up. And it's coming from the realm of Roman Catholicism. I read a little sketch of it a while ago upstairs. They too are making predictions. Just this past July the 1st, a 40-some-year-old priest in Portugal at the place called Fatima, he was communicated for the period of 2 hours by the Virgin Mary. And out of that, he got a 40-some-page sermon from her. And the predictions and the things she informed him that is about soon to be manifested in the human societies on earth. I tell you, brothers and sisters, some of it will never be because it's the devil. He's just using it to get a bunch of people that don't know their ABCs in the Bible to believe in a myth of something or other. That's why, brothers and sisters, I have got to look at this Catholic spirit in this last days. It's coming on the scene. It's hovering over a bunch of dead Protestant people that no longer knows a thing about real salvation. They're just religious. They just have religion in their mind. It's not in their heart. And you're not going to live this kind of life just in your mind. It's got to be something that motivates your heart. So this Catholic spirit, it definitely coming on strong. And to think in a nation that was known for centuries as a Protestant nation. Now then, you can buy these magazines on your newsstands and Protestant society just gobble it up. And this priest, the tragedy of it, this priest, he was so shook up by what he heard that certain things starts in 1995, 1996, 1997, right up onto the year 2000. He speaks of devastating things taking place. Well, brothers and sisters, I don't have to read that junk. I find it in the Bible. That don't make a Catholic church so. The Lord's already, I'll say this, everything's in this book's going to come about. But everything they say, brothers and sisters, there may be certain things come about and people will flock to it. But the point was, this priest was so shook up when he notified Pope John Paul II and told him of his experience. Pope John Paul, the way the article brings it out, was really a very nervous man. And this priest relates all of this stuff to him. And think of it, this present Pope, brothers and sisters, came to America knowing all of this, and not one thing was said in Denver. But when he begins to, brothers and sisters, sort of downgrade America, and when he begins to look at America's leadership, how that America should begin to take the leadership role of helping establish peace, you've got to realize, brothers and sisters, that man is looking at something right down the road. Now, I've said this before. I don't know that this man is actually going to live long enough to even be the Antichrist. But let's just say, if he is, he's going to be an old man. Because I know this. You've got to realize, brothers and sisters, human beings only live so long. And the year 2000 is 7 years off. And that means, brothers and sisters, that man is going to be in his 80s. Will you agree with me? Therefore, you've got to realize there's certain health qualities that he's beginning to enter into. And I'd have to believe, brothers and sisters, health-wise, brothers and sisters, I wouldn't seem a healthy man to go through the whole week of Daniel. But somewhere, brothers and sisters, if he sets a stage for something, then, brothers and sisters, if God took him over the scene, the next man, brothers and sisters, would step right in his shoes. And he'd have a vision to carry out only what Pope John Paul II has done here in these last days. And the religious world will just flock around that. Well, anyhow, now then, let's come back now to our line of thought. Looking toward the end through windows of prophecy. Now we realize that in 1967, right here, the Jewish nation was faced with something. She was living in a partitioned land. Something like this. That was an area that many Jews, from the beginning of the 20th century, from Poland, from Russia, from different places of the world, they had went slowly back and bought up acres, because that was the Zionist movement's original plan. Buy it up through centuries of time. So they were buying up this wasteland from these landowners, these Arabs. But that was not God's way necessarily. So UN was pressured, and they partitioned the land. But since the Palestinian Arab in there did not want a statehood, and they didn't want these Jews to be back there, they fell on the idea, we will destroy this state. So King Nasser at that time of Egypt was the leader. And you know the whole story, brothers and sisters. In 6 days' time, Israel, living in a partitioned land, yet from 1948 to 67, God had successfully allowed her to grow, to obtain from nothing but obsolete weapons, primitive means to fight and defend themselves, to an hour where she had aircraft that was some of our best, as well as the French Mirage plane, which was also a very good plane at the time. Think of it, in 6 days, Israel to defend herself, pushed her borders, brothers and sisters, plumb to the Jordan River, plumb to the Red Sea. She took the Gaza Strip, and she took Old Jerusalem, which lays along in there. Now keep in mind, Jesus prophesied in Luke's writing, as he spoke to the disciples concerning the last days and the signs, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. It started with the Babylonians. Then it went to the Medes and the Persians. Then it went to the Greeks. Then to the Romans. He said it will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. In June 1967, after almost 2,500 years, Jerusalem had been under the control of some lordship, empire, dominating her authority. Think of it. The Jewish soldiers successfully drove the Jordanian Arab army out. And they knew when them soldiers stood at the western wall, weeping, lifting their weapons in the air, never again will we see Jerusalem flying another flag other than the Star of David. Now may I say this, brothers and sisters, the world of Gentiles may not understood what that meant to them Jewish soldiers. But keep in mind, every time they go to school and they study their histories, they study their history strictly from the standpoint of who they are. And that's why, brothers and sisters, it was important then for them to free that city. The only thing is, when it come to the Holy Temple Mount area, they stopped short of going right in there on that Temple Mount and running that religious Islamic bunch of leaders out of there and saying, from now on we'll take this over. They stopped short. They knew the world at that time would not stand for Israel to do this to the Muslim Arabs' religious belief. So they stopped short. So they have lived in this occupied area, and they put soldiers there and everything, all of this, and they've controlled the Palestinian Arabs. And brothers and sisters, since 67, you have read the history of the turmoil and the strife. And Western leaders keep telling Israel, now to have peace, you've got to be willing to give up some of this occupied territory. Now then, we can say this. When they refer to the Jericho is positioned along about in here. They're talking about a territory that goes something similar like it was before. Plus over here is the Gaza Strip. That's the ancient land of the Philistines. Now, as I said Thursday night, this is not giving up land. This is a domestic, it's a social and a political thing. I'll read what the Jerusalem Post says. Perez has said any package with the Palestinians should include Gaza and Jericho. And that's what I pointed to there. A declaration of principles on self-rule in the rest of the territories and the early assumption of authority complete with international economic assistance. Now, here's the sad part, brothers and sisters. And I want to show you something. As Israel then allows these Arabs living in this Jericho area and the Gaza Strip area for them to have self-rule within them territories, then it means the Western world is going to have to come along now with finances and help to stabilize a lifestyle and an economy within those. You see what that's going to... there goes some more of your tax dollars. Just to fulfill what our leaders say Israel must do. We're going to have to pay the bill. We will go ahead here. At the core of the reported Perez Abu Mazon, that's the Muslim leader, agreement would be the redeployment of Israeli forces away from the Palestinian population. That means Israeli troops will no longer ride through Jericho in jeeps, keeping their eyes on the Palestinian Arab. It'll be Palestinian Arabs who will have to furnish their own police force. Same way over in the Gaza Strip. We are not talking about total IDF withdrawal. Now listen carefully to this. From Gaza and Jericho. However, the Palestinians would control their internal security. We would be in charge of dangers being posed to Israelis, an official said. Senior officials rejected the idea that Palestinians outside the territories could simply immigrate to Gaza or Jericho. We would control the borders and the sea. We will not allow any right of return, an official said. Now, what does that mean? Old Jerusalem, and I'm talking about Old Jerusalem, 3/4 inhabited by Palestinian Arabs. Old Jerusalem is the ancient capital of the land of Israel. It is Old Jerusalem that fills the prophetic picture here when we get to Isaiah chapter 60. And in Isaiah chapter 60, it plainly tells us that the inhabitants, that's through the centuries, that has made it look waste, desolate, and run down, will be far removed. Now, with that in mind, brothers and sisters, that 3/4 Arab population in Old Jerusalem, which is the Jewish capital, when they look across and they see the Palestinian Arab here in Jericho having their own independence socially and politically, and they see their counterpart over here in the Gaza Strip doing the same, that's going to cause the Palestinian Arab in Jerusalem to say, we want our independence. They're going to say to the Israeli soldier, get out of here, I get tired looking at you. And when you see all these uprisings, brothers and sisters, and these Arab kids throwing rocks, where do you think that's at? That's not in Jericho. It's not in the Gaza Strip. It's in Old Jerusalem. How many realize that? So now the reason I brought that in, that is no doubt going to set a time bomb in motion. But it's getting close to 12 o'clock. I have another part here I want to read. Now, since we're talking about Old Jerusalem, keep in mind, on the south western slopes of Old Jerusalem, they discovered a few months back the ancient ruins of what they perceived the old palace grounds of which King David had made. Keep in mind, when King David took the ancient city of the Jebusites, you know how he took it. There was a certain strategic place he had his palace built, and that was known as King David's city. Well, archaeologically, a few months ago, they began to unearth some of this. There was a little bit of problem rose up between them and the political bunch. But now in that same area, as they have archaeologically moved things back, Jews, construction of phase 1 of David's village, the luxury residential enclave of the Mamilla project has been completed. 25 owners already possess their homes which face the old city walls and David's citadel. Because right there's where King David was at when he was having Israel all numbered, you know, brothers and sisters, and they was dying like flies. And then when he looked out the window and he was praying, and God gave him the ultimatum to do certain things, and he saw that angel standing right there with his sword drawn, that's where King David decided then the tabernacle should be moved to, and there's where eventually was to be a temple built. What's this? One has been so, Joe Hallis, chief executive of the project, anticipates that by Rosh Hashanah, coming up in the fall, virtually all of the purchasers will have taken delivery of their homes. The first model apartment of David's village was sold shortly after it was opened, and with the purchasers of that first apartment having taken delivery at the end of June, Chief Rabbi Israel Meir Lau joined Chairman of Ladbroke Cyril Stein to affix a mezuzah to the elegant new apartment which opened at the beginning of July. Ladbroke will soon start the building of phase 2 of the project, which will add 55 more residences to the development phase. 2 prices are to start at around, listen to this, $200,000. So if you want to return, move to Jerusalem and live in David's village, why, that's what you'll be facing. Now, why did you read that in there, Brother Jackson? All because, brothers and sisters, it fits in with one of the prophecies that we're going to come into tonight. But I think just at this time, while we'll end until tonight. Heavenly Father, we're living in a world, and Lord, there's many things going on. But you've left us a roadmap, not across mountains and terrains of archaeological territory, but Lord, through time. And truly, Lord, we travel as sojourners in a world, in an environment, and we can see what the devil has done within our present human society. I pray, Lord, help me to present these things in a way, Lord, that a picture of things can be constructed. And Lord, that together we can understand we are living close, Lord, to something that would show forth, Lord, your return soon to this earth. Now, Father, I thank you today for the salvation you have made possible for me, and I thank you for my brothers and sisters in Christ. Together, Lord, we look toward that great event with this blessed hope, Lord, of eternal life within our hearts. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen. May the Lord bless you today. And